My name is Bart Nason. Full name is Bartram Nason, but I just go by Bart. I'm one of the developers with Enableus. We're a consulting firm here based in Atlanta, Georgia. We do a lot of Drupal development. We do a lot of other development, WordPress and Node and mobile apps, or a user experience focused group, but we do a lot of development in addition to the design work. So what I'm going to talk about today, and this session is about, is using building web apps with Drupal and MongoDB. And I take it that most of you here are developers yourselves and have probably maybe have built some web apps yourself. Specifically here, though, I want to talk about Mongo Entity. I'm going to talk about Mongo Entity, which is a module that we developed at Enableus that integrates creating entity types and using the Mongo database to store your data for all the benefits that Mongo provides. So getting started here. So just a little bit of background. You know, I did a little survey before we got started, and it seemed like a lot of you had some experience with the Entity API. The Entity API is the Drupal stores all of its data, most of its data, with entities. So nodes are entities, users are entities, comments are entities. The Entity API is a module that you can download and install as a developer to help you create your own entity type. So if you don't want to use nodes to store information, if you're creating like a bookstore or something like that, instead of creating a node for every book that you have in your inventory, you could create a book entity that doesn't have all the extra features like the publish settings and the automatic page views and things like that. So if you just want to boil it down to the basics, the Entity API is a great tool for you to get started to create new data types. You can add fields and properties to them just like you do with nodes and accounts. And this is all in Drupal 7, so we're mostly talking about Drupal 7 here. You know, you can use a field UI to create new fields. You can define new properties within the API. Save, update, delete, create. I got those out of order, but you get the idea. So at the Entity API, the first thing that you do when you create a new entity type is you define a table a database table that is your base, that stores the properties, it stores the IDs, it stores any properties like titles that you want to add, publish status. And then whenever you're creating whenever you're editing your entity type, when you want to make changes to it, you always have to go back in and redefine your table. You have to add the new fields to the table. You have to maintain the schema of that table. So just a little bit of background about MongoDB. Who's used MongoDB again? Some? Or know what it is? MongoDB is a document-based database. So whereas with MySQL or any kind of SQL database, a SQL database is relational. So you have a bunch of tables that relate to one another, and you have a row for each piece of content that you want. With MongoDB and other NoSQL databases like it, including CouchDB, and there are a bunch of other ones, it's a document-based database. So everything that you store in a document-based database is hierarchical. All your content for your object go in one record. So if you have a book with multiple authors, you can save those multiple authors in one record instead of having to go join on your author table to see to load all of that extra information. And it can be many levels deep, and I'll show you an example of that in just a second. So it's hierarchical, it's schemaless. You don't have to define the structure of a document in advance. A book can have authors. Some books could have, you know, if you're creating a document with MongoDB, you can have a book that has an author, has a publisher, has revisions, and it's very flexible in what information you put into that document that then goes into the database. So when you pull it back out, it comes back out in the same format that you put it in. MongoDB is open source database. It's created by a company called Tengen, which, you know, like any other open source project, they have a company behind them that provides support and manage hosting solutions and all kinds of stuff like that. So Tingen is the company behind MongoDB. So some of you probably are familiar with this. SQL table. With SQL, you have as I was just saying, relational database. You have a table for every piece of information, and then to pull an entire object out of the database, you have to join all these tables together to get your information back out, which is great for a lot of things. You know, SQL is a tried and tested technology that has been around forever, and is, you know, performance is super for certain types of applications. But once you start creating all these relationships and indexes and different ways of querying it, it can be slow for the server for computing, but it can also be slow for the developer. It can be a challenge to conceptualize all these ideas in your head and create a platform that gets your data back efficiently. So MongoDB Collection, with MongoDB, instead of having tables, you have collections. And inside a collection, you have, instead of having records or rows, you have documents. So when you go into a MongoDB database, they have a great little command line tool, and instead of saying select star from table whatever, where field equals such and such, MongoDB uses a modified JSON JavaScript object notation format to store its data. It actually stores it in a binary format, but when you put it in and take it out, it's always converting it into this this sort of quasi-JSON format. So if you had a collection of, again, using the bookstore analogy, if you had a collection of books in your bookstore, this is from a little personal project that I did a while back, you can store, you know, just records like you would with a SQL table. So if you had a SQL table for your books, you'd have a title, and you would have an author and an ID, obviously. But you can also store objects and arrays inside that document. So here we have some links to other sources. If you're building a web app and you wanted to link to the book on Goodreads, you could have an object for the Goodreads link with the URL and a label. You could have a link to the New York Times website if there's a book review that you want to have. And it can be hierarchical and nested like this, so you can have multiple objects all in that one database or in that one document. And that document can be any size that you want. It can grow. You can have 10 objects within that links property. You can have one. You can have none. You could have it can be any structure that you want from one document to another one. So why is MongoDB? If you ever think about why is it a good choice for Drupal? If you ever think about if you've ever built some web app with the Entity API, you know, you can add a bunch of fields to your entity, and then you can have entity references, and very quickly with Drupal, especially with the field API, you can quickly have a very complex object where you have a lot of different things that you're relating into this one object. And the idea for us for this MongoDB module came from a web app we did where we had over 200 fields on a node, and some of them were field collections, and then some entity references, because the client had all this data that they wanted to relate. And so with the field API in Drupal, especially in Drupal 7, with every field you add, you're creating a new table or two new tables for each of those fields. So every time you load a node from your database with SQL and Drupal 7, you're joining all of those tables together. So not a great system if you have a huge data set like we did for this project. So Mongo Entity turns those fields into one big document. Those fields and properties all go into one big document. So when you are loading your entity, it just takes one query to the database to get it all back. Using Mongo Entity, it's Drupal 7 only right now. You need Drupal 7. You need the MongoDB database server from Tingen. PHP has a Mongo extension that you need to install, which is really easy. It's just if you use Peckle or Pear, you can install it with with those command line tools, peckle install Mongo. And then, so Mongo Entity, also the Mongo Entity module relies on a MongoDB module that's a contributed module with Drupal as well. I think that it has a little bit of support from Tenjin. CHX, is that the user? I think he has done a lot of work on it, or the maintainer of it now. So, so that one, the MongoDB module that is available with Drupal does a lot of cool things. So you can install this module, the MongoDB module for Drupal, and it can use the Mongo database for things like caching. It can replace your watchdog tables with Mongo documents sessions, and it even does the field storage. So if you enable the field storage module, the Mongo field storage module with Drupal 7, it will take your nodes and it will write all the fields to the Mongo database instead of the SQL database, which is great. If you're looking for a very quick performance boost, especially if you have a situation like I was just talking about, where you have 200 fields on a node type, and you are getting slammed by the server because it's a pain in the butt to load all that stuff, the MongoDB field storage module is great right out of the box. But it doesn't support, last time I checked, it doesn't support creating your own entity types. It'll add the fields, but it won't add, it doesn't handle your properties. So the MongoDB module is great, and it's a requirement for Mongo Entity. Faster query. Very simple install. You install the MongoDB database. You go into your settings.php file and configure the database, the URL to your database, just like you would with a MySQL database in your settings.php file. So Mongo Entity, as I said, you can store the entire entity in one shot right in your database. You don't have to maintain tables and schemas and relationships. You can quickly create a new entity type without having to define a schema. You just use we'll see in just a second, the hook entity info. And then it also supports embedded entities. So if you've ever used field collection or some of these things where you want to have repeating fields on repeating entity references or repeating entities inside of another one, this Mongo Entity module has what's called embedded entities, which will store children of a entity inside the document as well. So creating a new entity type with Mongo Entity works it's the same as many other, as creating any other entity type. It uses the hook entity info, and again, you need the entity API installed. But the things to note here are that your entity class is going to be this, once you have the module installed, your entity class is the Mongo Entity, and then we have a controller called Mongo Entity Controller. So that's the secret to getting started here, just replacing the entity class and controller class with either of these two classes, or you can extend these classes as well, as we'll talk about in a minute. You don't need a base table. That's the great thing about this. If you've used hook entity info, you know you need to define a base table. It's not required when you're using Mongo Entity. So the rest of the things here, if you're not familiar with creating new entity types, hook entity info defines your entity type. So like I said earlier, a node is an entity type. So you have a label, you have your entity class and your controller class. And then you have some other options. You can create bundles on entities. So just like you have different content types when you're creating a node, bundles are the same thing. So if you had a book, you could have different bundles. You could have fiction bundles. You could have nonfiction bundles. You could have children's book bundles. You can have different types of the entity type that you're creating. Setting it to fieldable will allow you to create fields on the entity type. Setting it to revisionable, which I'm not sure is a word, but it seemed like it made sense, allows you to create entity revisions with Mongo Entity as well. I know there's time for questions at the end, but if anybody has questions as we're going along, please, yeah.
Please, okay, this will create this field for storage, sure. What about the UI? Will it also automatically show up on manage fields and not just manage field, but also manage description?
Manage display? It does, in fact. Actually, when you add the bundles, Mongo Entity provides a page, just like if you go to structure, content type, and I think that might be the next slide. Let's just see. Well, it has, Mongo Entity provides an admin page for all of your Mongo Entity fields where you can go in and manage those fields and manage their display without having to write your own UI controller for that.
Are you going to do a demo of that?
I can. I'll show you. Yeah. I have a screenshot of it. I forgot my dongle for my laptop, so I don't have a dongle for my laptop, so I'm using this fine, lovely PC here. Oh, do you? Okay. Maybe at the end I'll wire up and see if we can do that. So this creates your new entity type. Again, it works a lot like creating normal entities. You just change that entity class, entity controller to use the ones that are provided by Mongo Entity.
I tried to install the modules now while we're doing this stuff, and it requires PHP extension for Mongo.
Yeah.
So
yeah. You can install it with PECL or Pair. Just PECL install Mongo. You can add properties and fields to your Mongo your entity type. It's just another hook. Hook entity property info is the hook that you use for creating properties. Fields are properties. Properties are just very basic attributes like title, status. They don't have that field naming system that you see when you create fields where it's field underscore. You can define properties. All you need to do is set the type. So if you had a book and you want to set the title, give it a title property. You define the title, and then the type for a title would be a text.
What's the difference between fields and properties?
What's that?
What's the difference between properties and fields?
Fields are properties. Fields add in all that extra UI validation, entity metadata wrapper stuff. Fields are just glorified properties that are have a lot of extra things on top of them.
Like status, affiliation, dates are properties, but
yeah,
body is a field.
Yeah. So as I was saying, when you create any type, if you set it to fieldable and you create a bundle for it, you automatically get the field UI. If you have the field UI module enabled, when you create any type, you need to set it to fieldable equals true and create at least one bundle for it. And Mongo Entity will give you the UI for it, as well as a listing of pages for your a page with a listing of all your Mongo Entity types. So you can quickly create here again a book entity type. You could quickly create a title, a text field, entity references. If you have other entities, they don't have to be Mongo entities. They could be anything. It could be a node. It could be whatever kind of reference you want. And then you can also create your embedded entity fields here as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Yeah?
You mentioned that you could create entity references to entities that are on Mongo. Can you do that in reverse?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Because entity type, or a Mongo entity is just regular entity. It has an ID, and that's all the entity references uses to. So it just would reference that ID.
So it seems like you're really using the Drupal standards, so pretty much any module that can use entities and bundles can use this.
Yes, that's the goal. It's supposed to be seamless. I don't have it in the slides, but views, it's a little bit of a problem with views. Views don't work out of the box, but the EFQ backend, any field query backend, will let you use Mongo entities with views, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Yeah.
So if it wasn't apart from views, or if it wasn't views, is there a way that you could essentially automatically replace the use of MySQL lately with
Wouldn't that be lovely?
What is the question? Can you please?
Oh, sorry. The question is, can we just get rid of MySQL? Can we just use Mongo Entity for all of our data structure? Not at the moment. They're with things like the database next generation. They're trying to get away from that. But the user tables, the node tables, there are so many tables in Drupal, the sessions and the variables and all that kind of stuff. They still rely on the MySQL database. So, yeah.
Maybe I missed this, but okay, fine. So the node table, user table cannot be replaced. But can this somehow transparently replace the other field tables transparently without.
Right. This if you are storing your data, if you have a Mongo entity type with fields, all the fields are going into Mongo.
Yeah, but that's not transparent. What I mean is, like, let's say I create a content type with custom, article, for example, has body field.
Okay.
Will body go into this automatically?
With the node?
Node body is separate from node table, right?
Right. With nodes, the Mongo field storage module, which is separate from this one, will do that for you. This is just for creating your own entity type.
Okay, so with Mongo field storage module, I can pretty much get rid of most of the field underscore data tables.
Yes, you can. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, do you know if that actually performs much better? Or?
I'll be honest, I don't know. I haven't done any kind of benchmark testing to really determine the performance of that, but it's another option we have there. So just again, if you've created entities before, some of this may be you've probably done this before, but once you create an entity type, any kind of entity type, you can use the entity API's CRUD methods to create, read, update, and delete them. With the new entity type, there's a hook form for the entity type. So creating a new book entity type, I can create a book form, which will be the add and edit form for that entity type. This is very simple here. This is just your standard Drupal form. You have if you're using fields, you can use field attached form to add in that field UI to your new entity form. Submit, save, validation, submit. Again, I'm kind of skipping over this because I think a lot of you have done this before with regular entities. You validate and save it. Use entity save to save that entity to the Mongo database.
And you said you haven't done any benchmarking to see it.
I have not. Yeah.
Okay.
So querying to load these back out, to load these entities back out of the database. If you're doing things the wrong way with entities, the old way, you're doing a DB query and you're selecting the ID and you're doing some crazy joining on your tables to get your fields out. The right way, the Drupal way to load entities is using the entity field query class, which provides conditions for loading things by fields, by properties, by entity types, by bundles, sorting, and all that kind of stuff. Mongo Entity works with entity field query right out of the box. It also works with entity load. Entity load takes the entity load function has a few parameters or arguments. One of those is deprecated, but you can pass in conditions straight into entity load, and it will work with Mongo Entity as well. So you can say, if you just want to very quickly get something by title, you can use entity load as well. Yeah?
You may have covered this, but peeling back the layers a little bit when you look at the actual structure of the data in the MongoDB database. When you've got a fielded entity, are those fields stored in the document?
Yes, they are.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. One document for your entity, everything's in there. So again, if you're not familiar with entity field query, it's part of the entity API. You can query by entity condition. You can query by fields, and then you just have to load the results once you get the results back from the entity field query. Yeah.
So what would happen to the data in database if you change your entity info? If you add a field, let's say, and you already have documents in the Mongo database.
Oh, it loves that. It would handle it right out of the box. Your old entities would stay the same, and your new ones would have that new field. And whenever you go back in to update the old ones, you could add the field if you want to. But again, MongoDB is schemaless, so it doesn't care what the structure, which fields you have to define, doesn't care what properties you're using.
renaming
renaming a field.
Yeah, you will have to go. Pretty much it would be a new field.
Yeah, well, you can't really rename a field anyway, and at least not through the field UI. You'd have to basically delete the field and create a new one. You could write an update function to rename it, but yeah. All right, moving right along. So embedded entities I think are pretty cool with this because, again, if you've ever used in Drupal 6, I guess, is field groups. In Drupal 7, it's field collections. If you want to have multiple entities inside of a node or something like that, it just doesn't work very well. Field collection, I know last time I checked, was still sort of a marked as a dev module, and even so, when you want to have a child entity of a parent entity, you're still doing a lot of database table joinings and loading and things like that. So Mongo Entity gives you this embedded entity class right out of the box where you can say these are going to be children of the parent. And a good example of that, just to continue with the bookstore, would be you have a book and the book has some chapters and you want to store the title of the chapter and the number of pages in the chapter and store them in some sort of order. You could create an embedded entity, chapter embedded entity for a book, and so then all of those chapters are just stored with the parent book document. You don't have another table that has the chapters for that book. You don't have another document, another collection somewhere else. It's all in one unified document. So creating an embedded entity type works pretty much the same as creating a regular Mongo entity. The only difference is there's a new controller class for the embedded entity, Mongo Embedded Entity Controller. See right here, you can use the same entity class. It doesn't care. The controller is what determines how entities are saved and loaded and deleted and so on and so forth. So to create that chapter entity type, I just create a new entity type and set the controller class to Mongo Embedded Entity Controller. So I can create embedded entity fields through the field UI, as you saw a couple slides back. It's like creating any other type of field, like creating an entity reference or creating a text field. You just select it from the drop-down. You can also create embedded entity properties, and you can create array properties that are lists of embedded entities. So the trick here is using this embedded entity prefix on your type to differentiate it from a reference to an entity. To tell that it's an embedded entity, you need to say embedded entity : and then what the entity type name is. Yeah.
Can you have a first class entity and then make it an embedded entity? And can you have embedded entities be presented or queried as first class objects even though they're not defined as first class entities in the system? You know what I'm saying? Like
no to the first, yes to the second. So an embedded entity is always going to be embedded, but you can query an embedded entity by itself. So I could, and I'll show you this in a second, you can load a chapter from your book. You can say, I want all chapters that have 40 pages in them, and you'll get back a list of chapters that have 40 entity objects that have 40 pages in them with a reference to their parent. They'll have the parent ID on them so that you can go find the parent for that as well.
But you can't take an entity that's been defined as a top class, not embedded, and then...
Right, I can't save that chapter somewhere else without it being part of a book. Is that what you're asking?
No, it's more like if I define, let's say I've got two different things I'm working on, and I declare books and they're an entity, and I'm storing them in Mongo, and then I separately have, well, let's say authors in some other system or people, and then I want to combine them. Can I make a Mongo definition where that first class entity that's stored as its own document in the Mongo database becomes an embedded property of a book in...
Like you'd want the author to be in?
Yeah, so I've actually had a separate system where I'm taking authors, and they are their own files over Mongo. And then I've got books, they're their own files, but now I need to combine them. Can I later go back and embed the authors in some way? It would be a secondary...
Yeah, I don't think that would work very well. I think you would just use an entity reference there to say the author as a reference to the book. Yeah. Because an embedded entity only goes with that, like the chapter example, the chapter for a book is always just related to that one book. You never reuse that chapter someplace else because it's part of that book. So an author has written multiple books, so you could have a relationship there, but the chapter is unique to the parent. So creating embedded entities works just the same as creating a regular entity. If you're doing this programmatically, use the entity create function and set your entity type. The embedded entity can have fields as well, and you can set values on them. And then to save the embedded entity, you have to save the parent. You set the, oh, this is wrong. That should be chapter. Excuse me. You set the chapter to the property that you created or to the field that you created before. We created this chapters field or chapters property. We're just adding that entity as one of an array. And then when you save the book, the embedded entity is saved along with the parent.
Oops. Can you use any metadata wrapper?
You can, yeah. Yeah, it works just the same. That's a new feature. There were some bugs, and I knew I was giving this talk, so I was furiously fixing all the open issues this week, but it should work now. Yeah.
What about using GridFS to store images?
I haven't tried that, and I'm sure it doesn't work out of the box. If that's something that that the community wants, then that could be a great addition to the module. But I haven't done that. Yeah. Embedded entity fields, the sort of if you've used the inline entity form, embedded entities work sort of the same way. If you have created a embedded entity field on a Mongo entity, the field UI will give you a field for that entity with all the properties of it. So here we have a chapter embedded entity, and you can set the title and the number of pages on that embedded entity and save it right there with the book when you're in the form. So querying gets a little complicated when you're dealing with embedded entities because sometimes you want to query by the parent, or sometimes you want to query a parent by its children. If you want to query a parent entity by its children, you join the field names as an array in your field condition, and I'll show you that in just a second. And then you need to use a special class if you're querying embedded entities by their parent properties. So if you had a book where you want to find all the chapters that have more than 20 pages in them, you use this array syntax where you, instead of saying exactly which field you want, you say the embedded entity field and then the field on that embedded entity as an array. You pass that through the field condition function to look into the parent and then look into the embedded entity to get the value back out to query based on that value. And then the reverse, if you want to find chapters where based on the title or something else like that, you can use the, oh man, that's wrong too. We use it, let me go back a couple slides. The Mongo embedded entity field query. So this is a super class of the entity field query. The Mongo embedded entity field query you use for querying embedded entities when you want to use conditions on the parent. So again, create a new query that's Mongo embedded entity field query, and then you can use these parent property conditions and parent field conditions to just load embedded entities that match the parent conditions. So if you wanted to load chapters from a book with a given title, you could load the chapters themselves. This will just return the chapters, but you're also querying based on the parent. Questions?
So it's not going to work with views, right?
So views, the embedded entity, it doesn't. I haven't tested that, but probably not. Well, you could load the embedded entities. So entity field query. So views is very dependent on SQL database tables, obviously. But if you use EFQ backend, EFQ views backend module, you can query things you can build your views using the entity field query. So either those, so standard, again, I can't say whether those last two queries would work with views, but you can load Mongo entities. You can create views of Mongo entities using the EFQ backend. And then just a couple of quick things about MongoDB, how it's working. If you just show you what we have created, this is the document structure. If you go into the Mongo database and pull out a book document, you'll see that you have your fields, an ID or revision ID. This is actually something taken from the MongoDB module that other people are working on. It strips out a lot of those, what I've heard called Drupalisms, the language and reducing your field structure. So instead of having, if you had something like if you had a title where the cardinality is 1, it's only going to save one object in the database. It's not going to create an array that will then pull out. It strips out based on the cardinality that array structure that we see with fields in Drupal. It strips that out as well. Languages are not supported right now with Mongo Entity, unfortunately. But that could be something that comes later. And so then you have your embedded entities, and each embedded entity has an ID, a unique ID as well, unique to that entity type. And those are stored as objects within the main entity document. So you could have chapter 1, chapter 2, and each one has its own fields associated with that. Any question?
Yeah, I was just looking at your slide, and it's been a while since I've played with MongoDB, but I thought that the IDs by default on Mongo were wiki IDs.
They are by default. However, the entity API requires integer IDs. So Mongo doesn't require, that's actually my next slide. You can override it, exactly. So Mongo, that slide didn't get in there. Right, so if you've used Mongo, it has this globally unique ID that it generates most of the time for documents, and that's good for sharding and splitting things up. But it's not a requirement, and it works just fine as long as the ID is unique. So it's not ideal, but it's kind of a consequence of fitting these two technologies together, fitting Drupal together with MongoDB. You have an integer ID for your documents.
Any thoughts about incorporating some support for the UUID version?
That'd be interesting. Yeah, that could be interesting. Switching your ID to be that UUID, and then you'd still need some sort of integer ID for the actual entity itself. But because whenever you use entity load, you still have to use an integer ID. Yeah.
I'm kind of new to Mongo, but does that mean since you're forcing the integer ID, you cannot use sharding? You cannot use Mongo sharding?
I don't think that's the case. I don't have a great answer for that, but I don't think that's true. I think that any kind of unique ID, as long as it's unique across the collection, should work. But
it's more about generation, probably. Generating unique integer identifier across a cluster would be hard.
It is hard, and that's true. And so what the Mongo Entity module has is a collection dedicated to creating IDs for each entity type. So whenever you insert a new document into the collection, it will find and increment the ID from that collection for that entity type and use that new integer that it's created. Then, just like a sort of an auto index with SQL, just it's a little bit more complicated.
Would that work across clusters?
It should. I mean, the document is unique. It's indexed so that you can only read and write to that collection. It has a lock on it when you read and write. So the ID that the integer that's returned is always unique for that entity type. And lastly, performance thing, indexing. MongoDB has for any kind of performance, you need to define your indexes. So you can right there in the entity info, you can use the index property. If you've used MongoDB with PHP directly, all these values get passed directly to the ensure index function. So if you want to understand the how to index your entity a little bit better, you can just look at the PHP document for ensure index within a Mongo collection. And it just says basically that what we're creating here are two separate indexes. There's you can create an index on one of your fields, or you can create an index on a property and ensure that it's unique, so that you can never, in the second example, you'd never want to have two books with the same ISBN. So it's just saying that the ISBN is unique. You can create indexes too that on multiple fields, so that if you wanted to have an index on the title and the author, you can do that as well. And I think that's it. So if you want to get started with Mongo Entity, you can download it from Drupal.org. It's still in a beta release right now. Issues are welcome and patches are welcome, and we've used this on a couple of 3 projects now, and it's performance. I wish I could speak to performance. What it has been is a huge developer performance improvement. It speeds up the development process so much, not having to manage your database tables. And it's, so that's it. Thank you. I'll take questions, more questions.
Update hooks. Is there anything different you would do? Like any schema handling generally?
Right. Nope. No, you don't do it. You don't need to do it. Are you talking about like update in hooks? Yeah. And the install? There's no need for changing. There's no schema, so there's nothing to change. So when you change the structure of your entity, if you add new properties or remove properties, you do it all in that entity info or entity property info hook. And it just works out of the box.
No, but I mean, you from 1.0 of your module to 2.0 of your module, you added some significant, and you need to add some default values or something.
Yeah. You could do that. You could do that in an update hook where you just go through all of your entities and just resave them with that new value. Just load them all and then save them again. And definitely done that, and it works fine. Any other questions? Yeah.
What are the advantages performance-wise in Mongo Entity over something like Memcache, Redis, key value lookups?
Memcache is great, and Drupal has a lot of caching things. And in the example that I was talking about before with the node with 200 fields, even with SQL, performance wasn't that bad because of all of the great caching that Drupal does out of the box, especially with the fields. The performance advantage is that whatever Memcache can do on top of the MongoDB module, you'll just get that much more performance. It's designed to read these documents wholly from one place and stores them all in one place. And there's a lot of performance tuning you can do to and document design to make sure that your documents come out quickly and are not sharded across different servers and things like that. But if you design it well, then it should be very fast. And if you want to add Memcache on top of that, more power to you.
So it's just kind of the difference between SQL and no SQL.
Yeah. Any other questions? No? No?
Are there front-end tools for working MongoDB?
Just digging into it, there's one that I've used, and the name is escaping me now. That's sort of like anybody use it? It's like a all-in web page. You just drop this HTML file on a web server, and it starts with a G, and I can't think of the name right now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know there are lots of them. This is the one that I've used. Yeah. Anybody know of any other ones that they like?
Mongo.
Okay, great. Well, I'll be around all day. If you have any other questions, come find me.